one of the things I want to talk about, first of all, I want to say this is mainly about generic drugs, though the vaccines are what we would classically call generic drugs. But I just want to point out, I mean, as an older person, all my drugs are generic. Yeah. You know, all the drugs I take are generic. And I look and since I've read the book, I'm always looking at who does them, who makes them. But I mean, that's it. And one of the things you talk about there is that the pressure, the political pressure on the FDA going back to the 1990s, right? Which is that Congress wanted, all parties wanted generic drugs right now and cheap.
Right.
So they didn't care where they were made. They just wanted to get them, and they wanted them as cheaply as possible.
Right.
And we're putting pressure on the FDA.
Right. So, you know, the FDA wants to go to Congress and say, we are approving so many of these generic drugs, you know, here's our numbers. And now the FDA has a financial incentive to approve these because it gets user fees from the drug companies when it approves their drugs.
So actually the in a sense, the inspectors, and they've added inspectors, right, to some extent, are being financed by the drugs they approve. Their salaries are being paid by the drugs they approve.
Yes, you know, and you might ask, well, what could possibly go wrong with that system? You know, and obviously the FDA has every incentive to bury bad news about these manufacturing plants, to not shut them down when they find terrible things, which they do. I mean, you know, I think I may have read way too many of these inspection reports, but they find terrible things in these plants.
And you point out, and they make a recommendation for the toughest sort of punishment about essentially saying you can't bring the drug in, and then that gets changed at FDA headquarters.
Right, that's correct. Yep, yep.
It's pretty hair-raising. I mean, it is amazing. Can we talk for a second about the Chinese role? Your books obviously couldn't do everybody, and also because the Indian firms have been doing it longer, spent more time on the role of the Indian drug companies. What is the involvement, though, of Chinese companies in the US drug supply?
So the Chinese are really functioning as the sort of active ingredient makers for the entire world. They're making the fine chemicals that they are then selling to the companies that are making the finished doses. It actually started with antibiotics. You know, in the 1990s, antibiotics manufacturing just slowed to a crawl here, and it was almost all done in China. There's a fermentation process involved in making antibiotics, and the Chinese have been making soy sauce forever, are experts at fermentation, and also they can do it so cheaply. And one plant after another began moving over there. So really, you know, they are just, I mean, you almost can't take a drug that doesn't have ingredients from China.
And in terms of our inspections of Chinese, first of all, it must be enormous, the number of factories and just the size of China.
Absolutely enormous. So I tell the story of an FDA inspector named Peter Baker. He was a really enterprising young FDA inspector who sort of figured out how to get to the bottom of what was going on in the plants. But at one point, he was the only FDA inspector based in China with over 450 plants to inspect.
The only inspector.
Yeah, the only inspector, you know, and occasionally they would send people from the US to China to inspect, but it's an absolutely overwhelming task. However, he invented a sort of method of inspection. Instead of asking for data printouts, he would look inside the computer systems, and he had a sort of a high school, college level Mandarin, and he would look in the computer systems, and he figured out that both in China and India, many of the manufacturing plants were pre-testing their drugs, trying to figure out whether they would pass specifications, and then altering the parameters accordingly And then they delete the pre-tests because under regulation, they're required to share all their tests with the FDA. But he found evidence of this pre-testing scheme in the metadata of these computer systems.
Because he actually went in and looked at the computers.
Yeah, because he was looking.
And so in effect, they were keeping, to put it simply, two sets of books and
Correct.
destroying one.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So, you know, what they would show the FDA is all this evidence of passing results. But what they didn't show them was all of the pre-tests where they were toggling with everything to try to get to the passing results.
How, with your deep knowledge, I mean, one of the things is clearly over the years you've gotten in really fine sourcing and deep knowledge within the FDA and other things. How important do you think political interference has been in the FDA? I'm talking about in the US. And and obviously we can also talk about the Trump administration now, where we actually hearing about it. But
I mean, from time immemorial, political interference with drug regulation has been, you know, intense. And it's really affected, you know, what drug has been approved. I think it's sort of relevant that the cases in which career civil servants have stood up against interference are kind of legendary. So there was, in the case of thalidomide, which probably people have heard of, and that was the drug that was given to pregnant women to make them sleep better, and it yielded a sort of generation of kids with flippers and malformed limbs. And there was a career civil servant in the FDA who wouldn't sign off on this drug. And as a result, American women were spared the horror of what happened with thalidomide. But that's really the
which happened to Europeans,
which happened to Europeans. But that's really more the exception than the rule. And, you know, under the Trump administration, there has been a sort of to the death battle between the FDA's career civil servants and the Trump administration, which wanted to expedite vaccine approvals to come in before the election. And literally, you know, what scientists were looking at is, you know, President Trump single-handedly creating an entire generation of anti-vaxxers by making everybody so afraid and reluctant to take any vaccine that his administration was involved in creating.
And that's, I mean, the polling says what, 50% of people say they're not going to get the vaccine. I suspect that will get better as time goes on. But as you said, we don't know if they're going to be more adverse effects beyond the studies. Though the drug companies had to say they're going to try to make the data generally available, I think, because they feel like otherwise people won't make them.
Right. Although, you know, this 90% effective result that Pfizer announced, we didn't see the data. We saw a press release.
Yeah.
You know, and everybody is already losing their minds over this data, but we haven't seen it. Yeah. So, you know, there's really like, you know, first of all, you've got to see the data. But as somebody who spent 10 years reporting on data integrity issues or data fraud in pharmaceutical plants, you know, we have to reserve skepticism here over claims of data, you know. So we'll see about this Pfizer vaccine.
So they say they have some sort of independent outside group that looks at their trials.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I just.
Right. But so this is a 44,000 person clinical trial, and the data is drawn from 94 participants. So, you know, we got to just wait and see on this one.
Only 94 out of the 44,000.
That's right. Yeah.
Because they had it first?
You know, I'm not exactly clear on why that is the case, but that is the initial outtake here.